You're listening to Puma Podcast.
I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and in this episode of Teka Teka News.
In 2016, when Duterte first had the brilliant idea of mobilizing influencers for campaigns, it's not as rampant. It's more of an innovation in political campaigning. 6 years after, it has now become a norm, such that you really can't do effective campaigning without the trolls, without the covert political influencers. Hello, everybody. My name is Fatima Gaw. I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University in Chicago, Illinois, and I am the lead researcher for the research called Political Economy of Covert Influence Operations in the 2022 Philippine elections.
The study was funded by Internews, an international nonprofit that supports independent media. It's a pioneering assessment of the economic cost of hired influencers for Philippine electoral influence operations. That's a lot of keywords though, so let's back up.
So we know about propaganda, napakalumang term na yan. It's been used by governments, by politicians, by political parties to influence public opinion in their favor or against their opponent. We're moving on to another concept called influence operation in the last election. So what that means is that it's not just about, facts or fake news and that dichotomy, pero it also involves manipulation of public opinion more generally, not necessarily involving fabricated or false content, but just having people like paid operators to manipulate public opinion towards their desired outcome, which is in the context of election to win, the positions they're vying for.
Here's a concrete example.
So we know of this very famous and well-known case of historical disinformation about the Marcoses and the rehabilitation of their family name. It's been studied in the context of disinformation, the false claims about the golden age of the Philippines during Marcos Sr.'s time. But for the Marcos campaign and the Marcos, overall propaganda to be effective, it's not just about, falsifying things or fabricating stories, but also pushing for more positive campaigning. Pero yung positive campaigning na ito ay hindi organic. It's manufactured. Ibig sabihin, may mga hinire na operators to push for a specific message again and again until, it becomes something that's part of mainstream consciousness. And this influence operation is happening years before the elections. It's been seeded in Facebook, on YouTube. So that's one example of influence operation that's more of a long-term game, at least in the context of Marcos and priming people for the public to be open to the idea of electing another Marcos to, the top post in government.
These paid operators are influencers, a term familiar to most. But how exactly are influencers defined by those who research influence operations? Here's Jonathan Ong, a Harvard Kennedy School Research Fellow and professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, on Puma Podcast's show, Catch Me If You Can.
Influencers are often referred to as digital first personalities. So they're differentiated from traditional celebrity, whom we know through the movies, through TV. Often they're ordinary internet users who eventually gained a large following on social media through different posts, funny visuals and memes, but also stories about their personal lives. And increasingly, influencers are able to use their influence, their clout, for entrepreneurial gain. And that's why they're increasingly used as marketers and endorsers.
So now that we know what this study is about, what exactly did the researchers find?
We were able to identify around 1,425 influencer accounts who we suspect are participating in covert influence operations.
Covert or patago, which means the objective is for people not to even realize that they're being influenced.
And from there, using standard influencer rates in the market, we were able to estimate around 600 million pesos to 1.5 billion pesos being spent on political influencers for political campaigns, at least for the very top positions of president and VP.
This estimated cost is based on two payment models they came across over the course of their research.
Smaller, modest following influencers usually are paid on a pay per post basis, meaning you post 10 posts supporting this candidate, we will pay you this much. And then the more influential, more, I guess, notorious influencers who have more political capital in this context, they're often on what we call a retainer model. This means that they are actually under the politician's payroll. So they're paid on a regular basis, and they're not necessarily following very strict terms of engagement. Whenever the politician needs some attacking and against the opposition, or some positive campaigning for the candidate, the influencer is basically on call to do that.
None of it was declared in campaign spending, right?
Oh, none, not at all. Another finding that we wanted to highlight is that these influencers are also not necessarily engaging with politicians directly. They have intermediaries that engage with them. So there's really a plausible deniability on the part of the politician to say, oh, I didn't hire anyone, any influencer for the campaign. In fact, what makes the obscure nature of the transaction more insidious is that they actually don't have contracts. In the usual corporate setting of influencer marketing, you usually stipulate how many posts, what kinds of messaging are you going to push, and that influences the pricing. Here, the contract is just very informal. There's just that mutual trust, aka mutual risk as well, of revealing this transaction there in the public because it would harm their livelihood. Even the payments are also undocumented. We suspect it happens via private messaging, possibly through electronic cash transfer and not necessarily to their official banks. That makes it hard for reporters, for investigative journalists to find out more about it because we don't have a concrete paperwork or evidence to present that they actually are engaged in this transaction or engagement.
We'll pause here. I ask Fatima what surprised her about this study when we return.
You would think that the political campaigns are very organized and then that there's a clear market for influence operations, meaning there's clients and there are the suppliers, aka the influencers, and they have their managers, etc. But it seems like there's a lot of ambiguity in the transactions too, in a sense that what we've heard from our qualitative interviews is that you will be given some brief from the campaign, but apparently the influencers are not necessarily given that clear instruction.
Fatima says some influencers who are used to more direction from brand deals find this frustrating. However,
an interesting part of doing political influencer work, because they have the same, flexibility to be creative, and if they can have their own approach to political influencing and that's more effective for their particular audience, maybe that's also more effective for the politicians.
there's a rough estimate in the study of how much top presidential candidates spent on covert influence operations. Based on the projections, President Bongbong Marcos spent the most by far at 351 million pesos, followed by former Vice President Leni Robredo at 135 million pesos. But Fatima warns,
there's really no way to know how many influencers were paid to campaign for particular candidates, so we cannot really directly attribute that, 800 influencers campaigned for Marcos, 200 campaigned for Leni. We cannot really do that clear-cut attribution.
In short, Fatima's team checked on who the 1,425 influencers they identified were supporting on their social media accounts. So while we can't give much credence to these numbers just yet, what we do know is that there's evidence of nearly every big-name candidate spending large sums to hire influencers, and none of them are reporting these expenses to the Commission on Elections. So I asked Fatima,
Would you say that this is now like a systemic feature of our elections, employing covert political influencers?
Even if there are candidates that might not want to engage in, influence operations, it's a necessary thing if they want, to have the chance to win.
in short, Fatima's answer was yes.
There's always going to be that, darker side, vote buying, or, all those more offline voting or election frauds that's happening on the ground, even violence. I think this is the softer but equally insidious version of that dirty politics.
Insidious is the right word. Part of what makes this sort of operation so effective is the fact that they can be hard to tell apart from genuine posts of social media users sharing their political views. Here's Jonathan Ong again.
So influencers, first and foremost, have a degree of relatability, right? And authenticity. These are people we look up to. We kind of feel that they're friends. Especially yung mga micro and nano influencers na hindi naman super sikat. And therefore, parang when they start promoting a politician, you feel that there's an alignment of values. This person whom you've trusted reinforces na parang, okay, this politician also represents shared values that you might have.
Now back to Fatima and her study.
So what I want to say is this is not new. This is just another form of campaigning, and we, as the public and our institutions as well, like the COMELEC and the government, need to also adjust the way they regulate elections. So there are insights from research like this that is actionable, not just from the government, but for media, for civil society, that needs to be heard and to be considered moving forward and in preparation for the midterm election in 2025.
While we struggle to find a way to regulate influence operations, they are increasingly becoming the norm.
I think we need to move into more into the PR or public relations model. And my hot take for the midterm elections is that we would see less and less spending on the normal advertising channels like televisions or digital advertising, and into these more, covert influence operations. There's a reason why we use the political economy of covert influencers in our title. What we want to emphasize is that there's an infrastructure behind influence operation. This infrastructure has been built from the ground since Duterte's time, and it's now become more industrialized. So we need more people to look into this so that we have more evidence of these, not election fraud, but, just making the election more undemocratic, I would say, and that more evidence as well for future regulation.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. This story was made with the support of Report for the World. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Mark Casilian. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uy. If you want a crash course on influencers in politics, check out our show, Catch Me If You Can. There are 2 full seasons of the show out and ready for you to binge. And don't forget to follow Teka Teka News on your favorite podcast app, or listen to us for free on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you like this episode, please take the time to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.